Mono Sanbonani, hello, how's it? And shalom, welcome to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. That's right, welcome to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. My goodness me, it feels good to be back with you here on the show. Guys, it's going to be a jam-packed show. And, we're basically going to go straight into it insofar as the medium-term budget policy speech that was delivered by Tito Mboweni today. It had a veritable mix of mostly bad stuff and again, underpinned just how much of a mess we're in as a country. So with that being said, I'm just going to give it a few seconds, 20 seconds or so, just to allow people to hop onto the stream. I see you guys coming in at the moment. I will be keeping an eye on the stream. Olebechang, welcome to the show. I see you. Nikki Davey, TP Dupe, I see you. Lance, welcome to it, guys. I'm going to give it a few seconds, and I'll see you after the very short break. All right, guys, welcome back to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Excuse that little intermission. Just had to sort out one short glitch and make sure that my guests are on. And speaking about my guests, I'm going to introduce them in a moment. Let me do a bit of housekeeping before I get to the lads. And that's to remind you guys that if you want to support the Big Daddy Liberty Show, if you want to support my work, it's quite easy. You can do that, of course, by becoming a Patreon subscriber. The links to that are in the descriptor, guys. As simple as $1 a month. That is 20 Rand a month. It is a single cup of coffee a month is more than enough to support the work that I do. And the work, of course, is to get these ideas out into the communities. These ideas of, a free market economy, the very sort of economy that creates the wealth in any society, the tried and tested way of building a nation and building an economy. And of course, beyond market ideas, a free society, the idea that the individual and really families are much more important than the state. So I travel across the country getting these ideas out into communities across the country. I focus mostly on rural communities, informal settlements, and townships, prosecuting the battle of ideas in that part of the world. And what is the battle of ideas? You guys, if we're new to the channel, you're probably wondering, what's this battle of ideas that Big Daddy's talking about? It's the idea that a society that is at the point of crisis, like ours, it is a society, at the point of crisis where it is he who injects the greatest volume of ideas into that society that wins the day. And the ideas that I'm injecting, as I said, are those liberty ideas. The values that I'm standing for are those faith, flag, family, freedom type ideas. And it is those ideas, it is those values that I'm pushing into the communities with the view of saving my country, our country. So with that being said, welcome to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I can see a healthy audience here. Robert John, Dylan, Shingwedzi, I see you guys. Welcome to the show. I see Manpatria is also in the comment line. I see you, dog. He's going to be on, of course, in a few moments. That's Dumo Denga. If you're just joining us, the topic, of course, as you probably saw in the headline, is the medium-term budget policy speech. This is the speech that the finance minister does every year in the middle of the financial year to essentially, on the one hand, track where spending has been, but also to set out where spending will be going, not only in the rest of the financial year, but in the policy period, up till the next 3 years, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't quote me on that. I do have experts and much more learned friends on the line. Guys, welcome to it. We're going to jump straight into this one as I just quickly open up my notes. And with that being said, let me welcome my two guests on the show. I've got, of course, as I mentioned, Dumo Denga, the host of the Manpatria Show. And joining me also is Gideon Joubert, who is the founder and really the head honcho up at Paratus.Info. Please check both of them out. Let me just get them onto the screen. Fellas, you're on the screen. Dumo, Gideon, guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Slihle. Much appreciated.
Excellent, fellas. Now, I'm obviously going to begin the conversation where it should begin, which is, just off the bat, before I start peppering the both of you with questions, what were your thoughts on the actual budget speech and really the finance minister? Dumo, let me begin with you.
Well, for me, it was more of a mixed bag of goods. I mean, Mboweni mentioned that, yes, the debt is a problem, and he also mentioned that, the public wage bill also has to be cut. But at the same time, he also mentioned that, that the whole SAA and all these state-owned companies need to be bailed out again. So I don't know, so I just got mixed messages from it.
And again, mixed messages is the order of the day, and but there is a bit of crystal clarity on a few issues. That is the ever ballooning amount of debt that South Africans are being saddled with, and really, I say South Africans, the citizens are being saddled with it, because it definitely won't be the politicians who pay this debt. I can assure you of that. But we'll get into that conversation. Gideon, let me begin with you. Your first thoughts, your initial thoughts when you were listening to the finance minister.
Jeepers, Sishle, where can I begin with it? It was such a never-ending story, fantasy novel of wants and needs that Minister Mboweni wants to service with no means at his disposal, really. And I think the best crowning example of it all was the never-ending SAA story, where we have 10-point-something billion rand now being thrown down that fiscal black hole of corruption, where we are essentially defunding the police in order to finance SAA. We're taking money from the education department. I believe we're taking money out of the health budget as well. I have a lot I want to say about those things, but I'm sure we'll get to those in due course. But what a bloody disaster. It's a joke, frankly.
And again, fellas, I think you've set out quite lucidly where this conversation, and really the only way this conversation can go, which is the absolute clown world nature of that speech, number one, and also I like to say there is a big separation between rhetoric and action. These speeches are always filled with a rhetoric that implies the state will do this, the state will do that, we politicians will provide this for you. It's a very state-centric and government-centric speech. And I did a live stream this morning on my Facebook channel. Dumo, I'm going to come to you. I did a live stream on my Facebook channel this morning where I asked the fundamental question, will we see a departure in this speech, given the economic mess of, 3 million people added to the unemployment queue just in the last few months, really, in the last few quarters, a couple of quarters, an economic situation where we're sitting at nearly 95% of debt to our GDP, a unprecedented figure when you consider that in 2009, we're sitting at 30-something percent of debt to GDP, a situation where the economic growth of the country has all but stalled. We are seeing a deep recession in this country, projections, of course, that we'll even see a yearly slump of, some saying -4%, others saying -7%. Dumo, none of these numbers inspire a sense of confidence that the politicians, the very same politicians that got us into this mess, will suddenly get us out of it.
You're 110% correct on that. What is very worrying is that, as you mentioned, the government actually put us into this situation because, again, they wanted to save lives. And I do understand that maybe they were speaking from a point of ignorance, but we saw the lockdown has caused a lot of damage. But also, what is also interesting was that in the speech, Mboweni also mentioned that they're trying to create an atmosphere so that South Africa can be seen as an investment place, a good place for investment. But how are you going to do that when you make it incredibly difficult for people to do business, even though in the speech he says we want to make it easier for people to do business and so forth. So it just seems to me that, like, out of his mouth, he's trying to say one thing, but then when you look at the actions, it's a totally different thing. So for me, it's an absolute mess. And I don't think anyone will gain any confidence from this, because they'll just look at the numbers that you have mentioned now and say, listen, well, maybe South Africa is not the best place to invest in.
Absolutely. And Gideon, again, I have to bring it to you because, and I'll pose a slightly different direction, but same principle of, dire numbers that just do not instill confidence in the average South African. But let me pose it to you this way. Another interesting thing that the minister said today in his speech was, well, it's time, I'm paraphrasing, of course, it's time that we as government move the idea of spending money away from consumption, the exact words that he used, to being one of investment. Now, here's the thing, and I keep saying this to my viewers on the show, they know, hashtag don't be dribbled. That statement was not the first time we had heard that before. We have heard that exact same line, that mantra, if you will, under the Zuma years in particular also, this idea that all state spending will go into these various infrastructure spends, because they represent, they argue, the sort of investment required in the society. Now, again, the whole notion behind it is this idea that the state will spend its way out of trouble. The very same spending which is derived mostly from loans and debt. Gideon, your thoughts?
Sishe, those are all sweet nothings. That is the Vaseline that comes before the government decides to violate private pensions, retirement annuities and savings in the name of investment projects, which is really, we've seen what government means over the past 2 decades when they speak of investment in the post-Mbeki era, which is bailing out vanity projects like SAA, squandering money at Eskom and water, the various waterworks. You've seen the horror stories of what the Vaal River looks like. It just blows my mind. And just to quickly return to the whole defund the police thing, the SAP's budget is massive. Okay, the vast majority of it is squandered, wasted through corruption, all that sort of nonsense. But let us not trick ourselves for 1 second to think 2 or 3 billion rand taken out of that budget will mean that 2 or 3 billion rand less will get stolen from the SAP's budget. The people involved in corruption and stealing and graft there will carry on as normal. It means that the service delivery from a policing point of view will just deteriorate even further to a point of more non-existence, where it is already non-existent in many communities. It's the same that can be said for the healthcare budget. So what government is doing is it's taking sick and failing government institutions, and they're just cutting them down at the knees in order to funnel money into SAA that just, it makes me so angry, and I don't have the appropriate method of expressing how I feel about it.
It makes you and I both angry because, again, I want to, guys, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the speech, and I've got the notes here, I'll put it to you guys. Let me just quickly do some housekeeping. Welcome to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. If you have just joined us, I'm in conversation with Dumo Denga. He's the host, of course, of the Manpatria Podcast. Make sure you check him out. His details, are in the link. That's the Manpatria Podcast. Always interesting conversations and interesting guests, and his regular contributors there are actually very awesome. So Dumo Denga is in conversation with me, and of course, the man himself, Gideon Joubert, the founder of Paratus.Info. Check him out. He's my go-to guy for all things self-defense, gun rights, and of course, freedom in South Africa. I'm in conversation with these two chaps as we look at really Tito Mboweni's speech today and the absolute clown world nature of it as we're just beginning to get into. Guys, let me pose this issue, because before we go into the meat and potatoes, as I said, I want to talk about the overall philosophy behind this so that people understand why, for example, even as I posed in the title of the show, the difference between the political elites in this country and the ordinary citizen as it relates to a conversation around the budget. And I've always argued, for instance, that any spending that happens at a government level is not money that is literally to the benefit of citizens, insofar as the collection of it is by the state, the expenditure of it is by the state, the beneficiaries of it, by and large, are individuals who are in or close proximity to the state. The government is the biggest and the fattest cat in the I nearly said in the roost. Cats don't live in a roost. And I got lost by my own metaphor there. But effectively, the point I'm making is the state is not you, the citizen. There is a very big disjuncture between the individual, the families I often talk about in this country, and the state. Now, what do I mean by this? Just to set the scene up for those who are listening. If you were to listen to the conversation, the tone, and the content of that speech, and the question I posed to you at the beginning of the day of who will be the biggest beneficiary in the speech, who will be the controlling arm, or where will the vestiges of control rest? Will they rest in your hands, the individual, the family, or will it continue to be in the hands of politicians and really the political elite? I think your answer was crystal clear in this particular speech. Now, there's two things I want to pose to you guys, and Gideon, I'll begin with you this time. The minister does this weird thing, which every leftist commie and socialist politician does, which is to praise their efforts and their actions at creating a society where politicians make decisions on behalf of people and treat citizens as children who have to be spoon-fed everything. For instance, he goes on to describe how in this budget, 2.2 billion rand will support social housing programs aimed at the poor. A further 6.7 billion will be committed contractually to this program. So in other words, more cash for this. And over this total investment period of the MTBPS, goodness me, tongue twister, 20 billion rand over the next 10 years for this. Now, social housing program, for those who might be listening, might think, oh, but that sounds like a good thing, the state building houses on behalf of people. But then I always circle back to this point. The state is responsible for providing electricity. It spends billions of rands every year on that. Billions of rands are squandered in corruption. The state spends billions of rand in this country on healthcare. Billions of rands go into that, and billions of rands get wasted. Again, anytime the state and politicians are the ones who are in control, we see a lot of rampant corruption. And I didn't really hear any movements or realistic interventions, for lack of a better word, around how we deal with the increasingly corrosive state of corruption in the state when it deals with all of this money. Gideon, your thoughts on this?
Well, it's all best summarized when he celebrated the fact that half the population was essentially on welfare at a point during this whole pandemic response, also known as the lockdown. And what happens here is people who think, oh, okay, the government's going to build houses for free. Okay, firstly, that's not for free. That's taxpayer funded or debt funded, which is even worse. This is a government that has weaponized welfare to the extent it has. It celebrates the fact that half the population is dependent on a pathetic handout just to survive. It is an assault on human dignity. It is an assault on self-worth and on self-reliance. They would I'm trying to not get too upset about it, but the fact that we are celebrating it as a success story, that 30 million people plus are on state welfare because the government has so screwed their policies and the way that they've treated this economy that job creation as a result of private sector economic growth doesn't exist. We have to cheer and pop champagne and throw confetti at the fact that we've got so many people on welfare. That is not a success story. That is a fucking disaster. And it's the exact same thing with this housing project. It is a weird sort of pantomime of uplifting the poor, but keeping them dependent on state handouts, on pathetic state handouts, and essentially infantilizing them. And people are saying, okay, this is not a bad idea. It's terrible. And until South Africans change, have a mind shift, a mindset shift, and a change in perspective as to how we approach the issue of uplifting people out of poverty, and that the government cannot do it, we will just continue seeing the six-sworded thing play out year after year.
Dumo, more big state spending, more big state projects. If you are someone like me and are rather cynical, and perhaps even not just cynical but realistic, you know that a lot of this will sink into the pockets of tenderpreneurs and the rent-seeking cronies, ANC and other political elites. You know, for example, if I can just quickly quote him here. As a consequence of the fund, the student housing program, which is worth an estimated 96 billion rand, is underway. One has to wonder who are the people constructing all of this, because often it's construction firms and the various gaggle around this who are quite, the rent-seeking type. But let me move on. The budget facility for infrastructure. Remember I said there's this big talk by the finance minister that they're no longer going to spend money for consumption. It's going to go into infrastructure. Let me just give you a sense of what they're talking about here. All of which are big state-led projects. The budget facility for infrastructure, he says, will support new projects, including through blended finance, whatever that means, with the private sector, often, which usually means the private sector paying and the state controlling. But nonetheless, let me not be too cynical. These include hospital projects in KwaZulu-Natal, such as the extension of the Chief Albert Luthuli Hospital. He goes on to mention Tygerberg Hospital and Klipfontein in the Western Cape. And of course, this is the kicker that I found interesting. There are exciting new proposals for the development of more than 12 harbours in the Eastern Cape, KZN, North Cape and Western Cape. Again, these are mega projects, Dumo. And if the track record of the ANC has been anything when it comes to mega project, mega spending, circa arms deal, circa COVID fund, circa Medupi and Kusile, is that they firstly are never done on project time, and the costs escalate, and of course there's a lot of fleecing off the top. Your thoughts on these big projects?
Well, there's one thing I always say about these projects. I call them cadre enrichment programs, and that's what it is. You know, whenever you think about tenders anywhere in South Africa, just think of it as a way to enrich a fellow cadre, and that's just the ANC way. And remember, Zuma even said, I think a few years ago, he said that if you want to grow your business, you must join the ANC. So when I see that, like, there's these big projects coming up, I mean, I can see cadres licking their lips and probably planning their next big holiday or their next big car they're going to buy or something like that. I'm not sure. But that's basically what it is in a nutshell. And, you know, just going back to state spending and whether if it's on welfare or so forth, Lee Friday, a writer, stated that, look, the government likes to portray themselves as the savior of the people. And they do so by creating these programs and saying that they're spending so much money on infrastructure and so forth. And remember, their relevance is dependent on the amount of dependence on their programs. So that's the irony, is that, you know, for them to help the poor, they need to create poor people so that they can still stay relevant. So it's kind of a twisted thing. But and now that you see that they're going to spend even more, given the fact that, you know, the tax revenues are declining, and also at the same time that their debt is also skyrocketing and it's unsustainable with regards to servicing, I don't see how they're even going to get the money to do this, to be honest.
Absolutely. Guys, I'm going to shape the conversation in a particular direction now, because I want to look at the threats that are faced by South Africans. And, you know, the finance minister did his absolute best to try and dress them up in obscure language. He did his very best to try and dribble, as I always say, the public. One thing became patently clear. We've just had a conversation around all of these mega projects that the state was proposing, that it will lead the process of initiating over the next, between 3 to 10 years from now. You know, big harbors, massive social housing spending, massive social grant spending that was mentioned, including shifting what is currently EPWP, that's Extended Public Works Program, to what sounded like, although he didn't say it, a basic income grant, which was basically being introduced in the country. The idea that you pay people effectively for not working. But I'll get into that just now. what I really want to go into here is the danger, therefore, that the South African public is facing, because the question anybody should have had on their minds as they listened to these politicians wax lyrical is, where is all of this money coming from? We're already seeing lenders, whether they're governments, institutions, being very skeptical of dishing and doling out money to the South African government without certain guarantees. We're already seeing that, but the kicker then wasn't, the kicker was when Tito Mboweni then mentioned the following, and I want to get your views on this. Government, I quote, open quote, government has initiated a process to review Regulation 28. This is a regulation that governs pension funds and savings in the country, basically deciding what percentage goes to offshore spending, what percentage goes into bonds, what percentage goes into equity. So he says government has initiated a process to review Regulation 28 to make it easier, here's the kicker, for retirement funds to increase investment in infrastructure, he calls it, should their board of trustees opt to do so. Now, that's the bit where I argue there's a little bit of dribbling here, because we know what the ANC and lefty organizations, including the EFF, have been touting for a very long time, that they've looked at the massive pot of people, South Africans' savings, pension savings, and they said, hey, there's some easy money that we can use to fund all of our vanity projects as politicians. Because, money's hard to come by, but here's all these savings by these silly savers in South Africa, since that's how they view most South Africans. Gideon, I want to come to you first, actually, insofar as we've been warning about these dangers, haven't we? When we described the idea that take a communist seriously when he says, I'm coming after your pension by way of a policy called prescribed assets. This is the move towards that, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's not like we're conspiracy theorists here. I mean, guys like Magnus Haystack, Dawie Rood, and Mike Schisler have been saying it for some time. I think that I'm almost speaking to the echo chamber in the comment section by just affirming it. What grates me is that there are still a segment of society that have their heads firmly in the sand going, it's not all bad, it might not be such a terrible idea. Here's the thing. Our Minister of Finance, who really should be our Minister of Pilchards and bad food photography, because Tito Mboweni doesn't deserve that fucking portfolio in my mind. Sorry for swearing. I'm just getting really riled up. And I'm irritated by his constant tweeting of his food while people are starving and kids in the Eastern Cape are foraging, to eat vegetation. But the fact is, he's proposing we build 12 ports. Has Minister Mboweni taken a look at what our rail infrastructure looks like recently? Has he taken a look what secondary and tertiary road infrastructure looks like with regards to potholes and roads just not existing anymore? Has he taken a look at our water infrastructure, our electricity infrastructure, stuff that actually keeps our industry, what remains of it, going? We are now sitting in a situation where he is actually telling us we're going to build ports. I'm like, what are we importing? Or even better, what are we planning on exporting suddenly? Because we can't even keep the lights on. In an economy that has contracted by like 50+% in the second quarter of this year, we're still having load shedding. There is a terrifying and disgusting disconnect with reality. Your money, if your investment banker, if your portfolio manager or your asset manager is seriously contemplating that it's not a bad idea to invest in government infrastructure projects, fire him or her. Like, ditch that person. They have absolutely no idea what they're doing, or they are, going to benefit from it in a way that they don't deserve. That's all I've got to say.
And Dumo, before I come to you, I just want to do a little bit of more housekeeping and just to say thank you to Herman Ruiz. I see your super chat on here, the 35 Rand super chat. Thank you, homie. I thank you very much for that. His comment is, feeling sorry for BDL, I'll donate 35 Rand towards a Bentley Continental. Man, oh man, if only I could drive that. Hey, I wonder if I can even fit in that car, but that's another conversation for another day. Thank you, Herman. I really appreciate that. I see you, Roseanne Nell, with your 35 Rand. Thank you for the message. Keep up the good work, she says. Guys, I will get to comments and questions in about 10 minutes or so. There's a few more questions I want to pepper with my guests. You're at the 30-minute mark of the Big Daddy Liberty Show. If you've just joined us, welcome welcome to it. I'm in conversation with Gideon Joubert, who heads up Paratus.Info. Check him out. He's, as I like to say, my go-to guy for all things self-defense and liberty on that front. And of course, I'm in conversation with Dumo Denga, a face who you guys are quite familiar with on this show, at least. Dumo, of course, is the host of the Manpatria Podcast. Please also check him out. Oh my goodness, just as I say that, looking at the comments, Jacques Vint. Baie dankie vir die ondersteuning. Ek sien R350. Yo, dude. Baie dankie. Shoo. BDL, start a party. The comment from Jacques is, please start a party for us to vote for. I will shave my head and have a sex change. If that's what it takes, just do it. And thanks for the love. Amen. Well, you don't have to do any of that, homie. But dude, thank you very much for the super chat and the good laugh, because unfortunately the topic we're talking about is actually not that funny. And, you know, just before the little intermission now, Gideon was setting out a very lucid case for why it isn't funny. You know, we live in a country where, you know, large swaths of our population live in abject poverty, and worse yet, we've made even more South African families poorer, with as many as 2.2 million in this last quarter and really 3 million overall in the last 2 quarters having lost their jobs just in the last few months because of government policy and politicians' decisions, i.e. the lockdown. COVID-19 didn't do this to us. It was the lockdown and the asinine political decisions that were taken that put us in this mess. Dumo, I must come to you because, again, you know, you and I, for example, on the previous show that I used to host, Blacks Only, used to say this quite a lot, that actually the politicians are coming for people's savings. When they're no longer able to raise the money via high taxes in this country, South Africa being one of the highest tax countries in the world, when they can't raise the money in those taxes, when they can't borrow anymore because the international community has become wise to the ANC and their corruption and shenanigans, they start looking at South Africans to literally hold us by the pants, turn us upside down and shake us for our very savings. Your thoughts, Dumo?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I remember that being heard and said on many occasions on the Blacks Only show. And it's a worrying situation, because what that tells us is that they've run out of money. And instead of them looking and saying, hey, guys, how can this economy grow? Because, you know, this is not sustainable. It's like, okay, where's the next pot of gold? And it just shows you the level of ignorance that exists among the political elite, that they don't see how they can actually get more money through trying to expand the free market, lowering tax rates so that they can get more tax revenue, understanding the Laffer curve and stuff like that. They don't understand that. For them, it's, okay, here's the money, let's burn through it, and it'll just make us look good for the next so many years. And I think what they're probably hoping for is that maybe that base for pension funds, they'll hope that pocket is deep enough so that when they're gone, they won't experience the negative effects of it. And that is really, really bad, because it just shows you that these guys are not long-term thinkers, but short-term thinkers, and they're very myopic as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that really scares me the most, as you know, I'm keeping an eye on the comments, guys, and I see some of the comments, you know, what savings? That point is a salient one. South Africans have become poorer. That is a fact. If you walk into a supermarket and you look at the behavior of the people around you shopping, even at the peak times, you know, sort of around the 15th or at the end of the month, people are much more discerning. People are taking much more time in seeing what is the cheapest option of what they usually buy. And you see the pain of it when people get to the tills, where people are, you know, putting stuff back because they simply cannot afford a bill, or rather a basket of goods, which they used to be able to afford. You know, 2 days ago, and, you know, I thought I wouldn't share the story, but I just for the purposes of the show, you know, there was a granny in front of me, you know, who had just had one basket in the hand, and there were the most basic of items in there, you know, a small pack of sugar, a small pack of those Joko tea, shouldn't probably mention names, but a small pack of tea, what are tea bags? I need to say tea sachets, but tea bags, and you know, she literally had to put the sugar back in the tea back and only have bread and a bit of Norox beef stock. And And I just said, no, that can't be. And, in that moment, just because I was driven to it, I just opted to buy her groceries. But I remember thinking, if this is what I'm seeing in front of me now, how many more South Africans am I not seeing, for instance? How many more South Africans are suffering in silence? Even people who, for instance, maybe thought of themselves as middle class before and never thought they would ever become the sort of dependence on the state that they've been made now by politicians in government. Gideon mentioned it earlier on, what the finance minister was boasting about creating dependence of the society. A quote, him saying, during this lockdown, cash payments were paid to over 22 million people. Now, South Africa's population is just under 60 million. So just under half of South African population were living off of the state in one way or the other. And this is seen as a point of pride by the ANC. We're in deep trouble when this is becoming the conversation. Guys, I want to move it on a little bit, just to get into some of the meat and potatoes of where the money was shifting. I won't bore the audience with all details. I'll just pick out the major ones which I had to keep an eye on. And just as I say that, I lose my place in my notes. But let me go to debt servicing costs, because debt has become a massive issue in this country. The South African government is spending to the hilt, and politicians in this country are spending to the hilt, and that tax bill, or rather that debt, if you will be passed on to you, dear fellow South African, and your children. Now, debt servicing costs, he argues, have been revised down, but what we're hearing now and seeing now is that the government is willing, or is looking to stabilize debt to GDP to around 95%. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, if you just go back a few years to 2009, debt to GDP in this country was sitting at 30-something%. So from 2009 to now, just over 10 years, if my math is correct, we've literally almost doubled the amount of debt that we're facing in this country. And we're at levels where even other countries were beginning to default on their loans, countries such as Greece and Argentina and the like. Dumo, I know we often talk about this on your show, the idea that politicians spend to the hilt and really the bill is always paid by someone else. Talk to me about what you see as being the ramifications of the amount of debt that we continue piling on.
Right. The ramifications are quite dire, because if they can't pay it off, what happens next? Because now the reality is that when you take out too much debt and you have to pay it off, and creditors start coming along and saying, hey, where's our money? You're going to have to cough it up one way or the other. So I think that, this goes back to what Thomas Sowell has been saying, is that, we can't, let me just paraphrase him, but in a way saying that, there's not a much more dangerous way of organizing society in such a way that those who actually make the decisions do not pay the price for being wrong. And ultimately, we are going to have to pay for it. They're going to probably increase our taxes and stuff like that. So it's not a good situation. Whenever the debt is off the charts, they have to pay it back, and they have to get the money from somewhere. And now they look into us because, they can't take out more debt to pay the debt.
Absolutely. And, Gideon, I'm going to turn to you, because the choice quote, and the one that I even pushed out in a tweet early on that really annoyed me to great extent, is that politicians in South Africa, here's a scary quote for you. How's this for numbers, dear viewer? Right now, government is borrowing at a rate of 2.1 billion rand a day. I'm going to repeat that because I know some people heard M for million and not B for billion. Government is borrowing at a daily rate of 2.1 billion rand a day. Gideon, who pays that back?
Well, we do. And the parts we don't pay back, our kids pay back, and the part they can't pay back, their kids pay back. And this is, there was a meme going around the internet a while back when the US raised its debt ceiling again for the umpteenth time. And they say, who does the world owe all this money to, Mars or Jupiter? And I'm like, no, we owe that money to the future. Debt is nothing other than future income spent today. Mm-hmm. And the more government spends today, the more future productivity will just go up in smoke, because the more you will have to produce in the future to service that debt, because that debt ain't going away. And in fact, it gets worse, because debt comes with a thing called interest payments. And interest payments are nothing other than, I think I might be misquoting here, but I think Albert Einstein said compound interest is the most powerful force in the universe. It's also the most terrifying and the most destructive in that sense, because the more we borrow, the more those interest payments will be, and the less we're paying the principal of the debt. A debt to GDP ratio of 95%, I don't think it's hyperbolic to refer to it as apocalyptic. It's really bad. There are governments like entire governments would, in a sane society, fall on their swords and mass resign in utter shame for this situation. People would be investigated for criminal negligence and failure to uphold their oaths of office. People would go to prison for this kind of stuff. And we sit in a society where we're not holding these bastards to account for what they're doing. And that's my major gripe with South Africa, is we need more active citizenship. We need people to take ownership of their nation, of their national identity, of their citizenship, and say, okay,
Absolutely.
we're actually going to hold these guys to account now.
Absolutely.
We're not just going to talk on the internet about it.
Sorry, Gideon. I was just saying, before I open it up to the viewers, just in a minute or so, the other scary thing that really this really got to me in terms of just how frustrating it must be for the ordinary South African. If you look at public sector wage employees, and I saw some stats that were pushed out by Mike Schussler on Twitter, where he basically demonstrated that the average employee in the state earns, I think, as he said, between 30 or 40% more than the average employee in the private sector. So state employees in this country, relative to their private counterparts, are actually rather well paid. And the point is made by the finance minister himself, where he basically says, over the past 5 years, I'm quoting here, guys, over the past 5 years, public sector employees, that's government employees, their compensation grew by 7.2% a year on average. This is well above inflation in this country, which is always sort of sat around the sort of 3 and 4% range. And over the next 5 years, he argues, we'll need to grow much, much slower. I would argue that if anything, not only should it not grow fast and should grow slower, we should be seeing the state do exactly what the private sector has been doing, which is to literally not only tighten belt, but start retrenching. I know that sounds terrible when I say it that way, because, it's people losing their jobs, but there are literally some functions in the state that can be modernized, and many functions which shouldn't exist in a modern democracy. And a lot of those savings that you would see in the state should either go back into servicing debt or actually delivering services in a different liberty-leaning way, which I'll get to at the end as to what we do going forward. Dumo, let me come to you, because this is going to be a massive issue, I think, because it's going to pit government and the ANC, who are in bed with unions, against those very same unions who are now the largest in the country. I'm talking, of course, about public sector unions, the unions that have employees in government. They're now the largest in this country, which tells you everything you need to know about the shrinking of the private sector generally. I want to throw two things at you just to get your comment. Number one, where does this money come from generally to pay these increasing wages and the ballooning size of the state when the number of taxpayers also is dwindling? We now sit in a situation where only 3 million people effectively pay the overwhelming majority of personal income taxes in this country. Only 3 million people out of 60 million. Now, look at that in the context, of course, of the public wage bill. What do you see happening here? What are your thoughts on this before I go to comments?
Right. My thoughts on it is that, well, they have no other option but to go to the savings. That's how they see it, rather. I'm not saying that is the option. But that's the problem. I mean, the unions are not only, and when I say unions, I'm talking about the public sector unions, are responsible for a lot of the legislation which has discouraged a lot of business opportunities in South Africa. And that is also another issue, because now, I think from a political point of view, it's quite clear that the ANC, they're in bed with the unions and they're trying to satisfy the unions and also try to grow the economy. But I think they're starting to realize that, listen, they can't service both. They're going to have to serve one or the other. And and the money is going to be hard to come by, because at the end of the day, if South Africa wants to grow, they need to look at their legislation with regards to labor. And also at the same time, I mean, if you look at the wage bill for the public sector, Mboweni did mention that it has to go down, which is great. But again, how are they going to do it? And yes, retrenchment seems like the most viable option. It's not going to be the first time it has been done. I think in Slovakia, they actually fired the whole police force and made them actually apply for their jobs again. And I'm not saying they have to go to those levels, but they're going to have to find ways in order to service that debt. And one of the ways is to look at, the redundant jobs within the public sector.
Gideon, a conversation was had generally, and this will be the final point before I really go to questions, because I'm keeping an eye on time. A conversation was had, and I posted in the question of who really benefited in the speech. We're hearing and we saw the minister basically say, look, there'll be 10.5 billion rand allocated to the South African Airways for it to implement its business rescue plan, in Air Bunny quotes there. There is an additional 16.4 billion which will be allocated over the MTBPS period. He talks about the land bank, for instance, having received an extra 3 billion rand with an additional 7 billion rand coming to it. All of these are state institutions. All of these are composed of, people who are in close proximity to political power in this country. The conversation that was had by the minister in the speech really involved the usual cronies, and very little was said. The usual cronies, of course, being big business, politicians, and of course, big labor in this country, the unions. But there was nothing said about the small entrepreneur, the sort of South Africans who really make up the economy, who run the mom and pop shops, the maybe aspirant young entrepreneurs. Nothing was said about them, and really nothing was said in real terms, in practical terms, how we make it easier for ordinary South Africans to start the sort of enterprises that are needed to grow this economy. It seems to be, again, that those who are in close proximity to politicians, big business, big labor, and the political elites are the ones who walked away very happy from the speech, and the ordinary person, people like you and I, some of us who have lost jobs, by the way, are left in the lurch.
Absolutely. The only beneficiaries are the ANC and the connected and the cadres, and everybody else is completely screwed over. It's a terrible disdain and loathing with which government treats private sector entrepreneurs, and the complete lack of support that they get, small and medium enterprises, and how they're actually actively destroyed. Now, you said 3 million taxpayers, which is true. It's only a couple of 100,000 or a few 100,000 that pay the vast majority of taxes. The situation is patently unsustainable. And if the government isn't going to retrench and close down public sector enterprises and downsize, or whatever we want to call it, the situation will reach a point where they will no longer be able to pay salaries like they did at Saks, like they did at Mango, like they did at Denel, like they did at a whole swathe of state-owned enterprises and other government entities, and they will just be neglected to death, which seems to be the ANC government's way of dealing with these things. They don't have the guts or the balls or the ability to liquidate or shut these things down, so they just neglect them until they become non-functional and sort of disband by themselves through that non-functional status. The government cannot survive this. If they don't, they must surely understand it, because if they don't, their IQ is far below room temperature. I'm willing to say they know full well that the party's over, and they're still trying at the expense of literally every other person in this country to scoop what's left and enrich themselves. And that's the situation we're sitting in.
Guys, I'm going to ask you just to hold your thoughts for a moment as I open it up to the viewers. Guys, in the last 10 minutes of the show, we're going to open up I nearly said the lines. That's coming soon, guys. There will be a studio line you can use to call into the show and participate. But I'm going to open up the comments and maybe let's get some questions going to the panelists. With that being said, as I just wait for those to refresh, let me just quickly shout out the Excuse me. Let me just quickly shout out the super chats. Susie Pops, I see you. Thank you very much for the 35 Rand super chat. Pete Buttons, thank you very much. Your comment is, just try to donate to BDL via PayPal. PayPal says you're unable to receive funds. Well, we'll check that out. Am I being, disbarred? What's the word now? Deplatformed from PayPal? Let me see what that's all about, and I'll get back to you. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. I'll get to the comments just now, guys. I just want to be polite to the super chats. Herman Roos, again, thank you, my brother. Herman's comment, the land bank needs 14 billion Rand just to service the loans from the co-ops, and that money was needed yesterday. Land bank does not have money to help farmers to get production loans. Is that not just the sad state of things in real terms? Excuse me. And you're absolutely right. Again, whenever something is done by the state, whenever something is done by government officials, it's always inefficient. It never gets to the nub of what it needs to do. Why? Because there are no incentives to do the right thing in the state. When you know, for instance, that your salary is guaranteed and you'll get it at the end of the month, that is why you see a lot of inefficiency when the state decides to do things and spend money on your behalf. This is why we often argue that the liberty approach would be to rather take the resources and the power, break it away from the state, and put it into the hands of the citizens, in fact, the poorer citizens in particular, who actually need those. And there are innovative ways in which we can do that. One more super chat here from Jaco van Niekerk, Badanki. Jaco, keep up the good work, BDL, making waves. Thanks, guys, for that. With the 50 Rand super chat. Now, let me see if there's any questions here. Guys, you're welcome to also bring up any questions if you see them on your side. That being said, I can't see any. You're going to forgive me. I have bright studio lights in my face, so I actually can't read these, some of these. But maybe I see Nick here. Only because it's in bold. When are you going to talk about the threat to you by the EFF? Okay, this is about something else. Yeah, dude, look, the EFF are trolls. The EFF are, the sort of commies that I often deride and make fun of. But I want to keep it to the show. Dylan, I see your question here. How do we end the excessive state power once it is established? It feels like we're spiraling, down the drain at this point. Dumo? Lost Dumo there. Dumo?
My apologies. I was on mute. I was just saying that, we are spiraling out of control with regards to the debt. And we're going to just have to make some tough decisions to get out of it. And that's the reality. We're just going to have to do that. And we need leadership now. The leadership has to step in and say, listen, guys, this cannot continue. If we go any further, we are going to get into more trouble. So that's all I have to say about that.
Gideon, we're spiraling in control. You mentioned Denel. I see a comment here from PEHGT saying, hey, what about Denel? They're completely bankrupt now. Of course, we're going to see many more state entities go completely bankrupt, won't we?
Well, that's the thing, and it's a natural result of the criminal level of mismanagement and incompetence and corruption that infests the upper echelons of these state-owned enterprises and the like. And the fact that the money has kind of dried up now, of course, is exacerbating and accelerating that. So, yeah, there is no way around it. I feel deeply sorry for the talented and hardworking individuals, of which there are still a great many that are employed by these institutions. But this is also where the government is being horrendously irresponsible, where if you shut those institutions down, which you're going to have to because you've mismanaged them, get out the way. Allow the private sector to take over, because those functions can be filled profitably with due diligence by private enterprises who can employ those skilled and hardworking personnel again. So what government is doing is it's forcing this country into a corner where it cannot pay salaries of the people it employs, but it refuses to get out the way and allow the private sector to take over and actually do the job properly, which is actually not just a crying shame, but it is a crime, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And, just, to make your point, Stefan Jordan says, how do we justify taking money from the police and education when, we're in a country where there's 50 plus murders a day, and we even cut the police budget. I know you mentioned that at the beginning, Gideon, and Jacques is vent again. I'm especially, dude, a 1,400 Rand super chat. Dude, thank you so much. With his comment though being rather amusing. Consider this a bribe, he says. Start a party, we need someone to act. You are the chosen one. Hey man, you made me sound like Neo there, sort of like, yeah. Jacques, thank you very much. I am going to slightly ignore your comment for a moment, but dude, pop me an email at bdl@bigdaddylibertyshow.com. In fact, anybody who wants to get in contact with us on the show, email me at bdl@bigdaddylibertyshow.com. For you, Jacques, in particular, I'll set up my plan, my agenda for the BDL show, and you'll see why I don't necessarily need to be in politics to achieve windfall changes in terms of what I have planned. Guys, I want to get into some questions here. And again, thank you, Jacques, for that super chat. That is incredible. Just maybe 3 more questions because I'm running out of time. Guys, if you see any questions yourselves, please flag them and I'll happily just read them out or just have us talk on them. Palisa Ngopane is saying, another thing is that we need to keep the middle class happy in order for the economy to continue. And I agree with you, Palisa. In fact, it's part of that point I made earlier on, is that we're seeing politicians in this country erode the middle class. In fact, the conversation in the midterm budget policy speech had said very little about how we support the entrepreneur, the innovator, the very people who should be generating the jobs in our economy. And instead, we hear once again that the ANC would rather cut deals with big corporates in this country who are spineless, by the way, who allow the ANC to run roughshod over South Africans, and they'd rather cut deals with their chummies, their bosom buddies in organized labor. And you, the ordinary citizen in this country, or even the aspirant entrepreneur, were left out in the cold. So absolutely, I agree with you, Balisa, on that point. Guys, maybe just 2 more questions, as I said, and I must wrap it up. I can't see any unless you guys can see any questions. There we go. Spekerhond, interesting name, asks, do you think Dr. Kaban would make a good SA president? I have no idea who Dr. Kaban is. Guys, I don't know if you know that. Speaker, maybe just pop another comment. Let's see who that is.
Right.
Another question I see here is, okay, well, there's a bit of a debate happening on the comments. Guys, I encourage free speech and debate in the comment section. I have set up some moderators now. The role of the moderators isn't to ban anybody or anything like that. It's just to get rid of trolls and to unblock some of the comments that are often hidden by YouTube itself. I see Isabel Ferreira here saying, I think this is part of a conversation, ongoing conversation. I respectfully disagree. Before the pandemic came into play, your doctor would have told you that the mask will... Okay, this is a debate about masks. Yo, guys, these comments become rather lit on other topics. Maybe let me just find one to end off the show on. I'm going to scroll down here. Sorry, guys, the text is really small.
Can I give you a question?
Yeah, hit me. Maybe
Okay.
this will be the last talking point before we end the show.
And that's going to be a complicated one. So, how do people hold these lofty politicians accountable? Where do we start?
Yeah, dude. Look, that's the tough one. I've got my view on this, but I do want to have Dumo just chip in because I think this will be the last comments all round. But there is a need for Dumo, and I'll pose this to you just as an open question. Reforms generally in the political front. I often talk on this show that, there's a massive divide between who we are as South Africans, those sort of God-fearing, law-abiding, family-orientated South Africans, the faith, flag, family, freedom types that I often talk about. There's a big divide between us and the political elites in this country, the politicians in our political arena, which is mostly center-left to hard left. And who hold no values by and large and see the state as a tool to control us as citizens. And there is a desperate need, therefore, for reforms in the political space. Dumo, some of your thoughts? Maybe it's closing remarks?
Right. For me, I think the best way to do it, if people got spare money left over, they should donate to civil society organizations like the IRR and other organizations that just fight for civil liberty rights. And also at the same time, you gotta, tell people in your community that, listen, the country cannot continue this way. Teach people about the message of liberty. And also, you gotta change your vote. Guys, the problem is that the reason why these guys are continuing in this fashion is because they've got a base of voters that are willing to vote for them all the time. And we have to tell people that, listen, the only way we can hold these guys accountable is by changing the vote and putting someone else in. And if they also do the same nonsense, you vote those guys out too.
Absolutely. And, Gideon, my take it strongly supports, Dumo's point, but I'll add even this. I think it's time, and this is part of my mission, we show South Africans, particularly the poor, that firstly, you do not need politicians, you do not need the state. For all its pontificating, for all of its projection of power, the state is only as powerful as its ability to control the public and to fleece from it. So what you need, and what I think part of my mission is to do, is number one, the sort of civic education required to say that you, the individual, and you and your family are much more powerful than the state. And if you organize yourselves as a community, if you opt for liberty-leaning approaches to how you organize your society, rather your community, and more than that, if you guys literally organize yourselves, I'm trying not to say what I want to say because there's a whole show coming on this, but I raised the point earlier on Twitter that part of what I'll be spreading out there is this notion of umazakele. Mazakele is a Zulu word for do-it-yourself or broadly self-reliance. And I think that's the message we need to start pushing out, and what I'm pushing out in my travels across the country to informal settlements, rural areas, and townships. It's the idea that actually politicians are trash, hashtag, and that you, the residents of this area, can do things on your own. Do not ask permission from the politicians. Do not ask permission from the state. Let them find you already halfway through the work of fixing your own neighborhoods, addressing things like education, safety and security, healthcare. I know these sound lofty, but they are hard interventions that we have as liberty-minded folk. Big Daddy Liberty, Dumo Denga, Mpiaki Gamini, even you, Gideon. Hard ideas, hard policy interventions, but we can only win that fight. We can only convince people if we win the battle of ideas. And it is that, I will argue, amongst other things, and again, I've run out of time to go into detail, that begins the work of pushing aside the politicians, pushing aside the state, and actually having communities in this country, families in this country, take charge of their own destiny. You cannot have 26 years in South Africa of a conversation about rights and nothing being said about responsibility. And that's the thing about liberty. It's to say that there are these fantastic ideas that can build an economy, that can build a society, but the responsibility is all yours as the individual. Gideon and Dumo, let me just say quickly, thank you to you guys. Final word, Gideon, from your side?
You summed it up beautifully, Sishle. And when it comes to self-reliance, I keep telling people, you are the first responder to your personal crime scene. Nobody's coming to save you. Prepare accordingly. And that means mindset leads, training feeds, and everything else follows. That's it for me for tonight.
Absolutely. I love that. Dumo, final word.
Oh, yeah. My final word is thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And guys, yeah, man, always look for liberty. Don't rely on the government. You can always do more without the state.
Absolutely. Just very quickly, Dumo, how do the folks find you in your show?
Well, they can go to my website, www.manpatria.com, or they can go on Twitter at manpatria_ZA.
At Paratus.
That's me, Paratus.Info. You can find the Facebook page, the Twitter account, all that stuff from there. And yeah, that's it.
Fantastic. Chaps, thank you very much. Super appreciated. I'm going to get you off the screen. If you can just mute your mics. And thank you, dear viewer, for watching. Man, oh man, it's been a while since I've had a live stream on the show. So I'm super chuffed that everything went well. Super chuffed at all the super chats that came through. Lots of supers that I've just said there. Guys, thank you so much for the support, and thank you for watching tonight on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I will see you next week, Wednesday, again for another installment. Until then, look out for the vlogs that will come out every day or so. And I've started streaming on other platforms such as YouTube and, such as Facebook Live and Instagram. They're very new to me, and I'll have to figure out a way in which I can simulcast across the platforms, so it'll make my life much easier. So look out for those. And you might see me in your part of the world as I begin again my long tour around the country, especially as I'm currently in Johannesburg, and I'll be heading to Mpumalanga next, Durban, and of course down the N2 through to the Garden Route. So I'll give you full details for when I'm in your part of the world, as I again try and get these ideas of liberty, market economy, and building a free, prosperous, property-owning and non-racial society. Someone has to do the work of getting those ideas into the very communities that often do not hear them. And that is my mission, something I've devoted my life to. So look out for the show. Say hi when I'm in your part of the world. And look out for great content from the BDL team, what will hopefully become a team. Thanks to you guys who donate on Patreon, I can start hiring some people who can help with production and all that sort of stuff. Major thanks to you guys who commented. And remember, if you like the show, please like and share it across all your platforms. This will be now uploaded onto Facebook and will be available there in the next sort of 20, 30 minutes or so after this live stream. All right, guys, I'm going to end it there. And with that being said, let me just quickly say thank you once again for watching. If you want to support the show, the information is in the descriptor. And I will sort out those little issues that were mentioned in the comment section. Guys, thanks for watching. And as I always say at the end of the show, never trust a commie.